Hey, is everybody spread out enough? And Eric and I were talking beforehand about this, and I'd like a show of hands if you have not ever had COVID. I wouldn't have expected that, would you?
That's remarkable, and that shows you who comes to this session.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we saw was the vast majority of you have not had COVID. Is anybody here, would anybody here not be vaccinated? Okay, one person. So that's really unusual. What do you expect in our population, the number of people who have never had COVID to be?
Yeah, it depends on how you define it. If you go very rigorous with seropositivity, that means you had an anti-nucleocapsid antibody, which if you, let's say you had COVID in 2020, that may be negative even though you had COVID because it doesn't stay positive for forever. At any rate, at least 80% of Americans have had COVID, and some estimates are well over 90 to 95%, so in that range. And of course, the problem is that while it does increase immunity, because the exposure to the actual virus is different than the exposure to the spike protein of the vaccine, but that means you have to get through COVID, and you could get long COVID, or you could get very sick, or you could not survive. So there's the unpredictability of the virus response. But if you've had it and you're okay, you do get a bonus of immunity. In fact, that's one of the reasons I was very much against mandates of vaccines. Because if you have COVID, that's at least as good as a shot. At least as good.
But that's like saying, the studies looking at bypass surgery versus angioplasty and saying, if you have bypass, you're less likely to get bypass. Well, you already have to have the bypass.
Yeah.
Well, if you get COVID, you're less likely to get COVID, but you had to get COVID to not get COVID, which seems like kind of a bad deal.
But the point being is that, still today, by the way, I think you may know, CDC classifies fully vaccinated as 2 shots, okay? And that is completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because if you haven't had at least 1 booster, you're not anywhere near being adequately vaccinated now.
They don't care when you got those 2 shots? They just say 2 shots any time in your life?
No, 2 shots of a primary series, 4 to 6 or 8 weeks apart.
Within the last 6 months?
No, at any point. Any point. The problem is, of course, once you go past 4 to 6 months from those 2 shots, you're now vulnerable. And as you get older, the vulnerability to severe COVID markedly increases, of course. But the problem is that there's been obviously lots of anti-vax, anti-science, and some of that is legitimate with respect to if you've had COVID, why do you have to get 2 shots? Why can't you just get 1, for example? That would have been a happy medium that would have calmed down a lot of the anti-vax community, but the CDC, and I lobbied the CDC. I talked to Rochelle Walensky personally, as well as her deputy, and basically they said, well, it's too complicated to do that, because how are we going to know they really had COVID? I said, they had a test. They had a PCR test. That's good enough. But no, we have to dumb it down, and everything's dumbed down, whether it's everyone has to have these many shots or fully vaccinated is only 2 shots. These are just unfortunate things trying to navigate through what has been a marathon and difficult phase for all of us.
It's poignant to be here because the last time I was here was 3 years ago, and it was January 2020, so it was right, a lot of you are here probably, and it was right before COVID hit, and we were all like, oof, we got through the festival, and then COVID hit. Wasn't that great?
That's when I was here last, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the next conference got canceled, and then the next one got canceled, so we're so thrilled to be back here. But thinking back now, I'm looking back at the rhetoric that was coming out then, it's interesting, everybody was concerned about flattening the curve. We're approaching 7 million lives lost globally to COVID.
Oh, it's probably much more if you
much,
count
that's
excess
official,
mortality.
Right? That's like known.
Right.
Like, so 7 million lives lost to this, over 1 million in the United States alone. Did we flatten the curve? How did we deal with that?
I mean, I think what you lose perspective is that all the best estimates would say now we've saved at least 30 to 40 million lives by vaccination around the world, which is extraordinary.
But the vaccination came out after the first year, Eric, right? Did things that did we do things that first year that also saved lives?
Not much.
No.
The problem I think most people will recall is that shortly after this meeting in January, when there already was COVID in this country on the West Coast, there was no test for over 2 months.
Right.
And basically we seeded the entire country, and people were coming into the hospital with pneumonia, and it was COVID. And this was happening all throughout the country. So because the government at that time was not willing to take the COVID test that the WHO offered, unlike any other country in the world, we basically had a contaminated test that was worthless, and it led to profound spread.
Yeah.
And of course, the only counter that happened, this is momentous, is that within 10 months, we had a vaccine that had 95% reduction of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths within 10 months of this pathogen being sequenced. There's never been anything like this. And of course, people still take that for granted, which is amazing to me.
Right.
This is, to me, the most impressive thing that's happened in the history of medicine, to be able to rally like that so quickly and have, by the way, those 95% suppression of infections and transmission, that went on all the way through Omicron, which, as you may remember, around Thanksgiving of 2021 is when we started to see Omicron. But for quite a good part of this pandemic, we have had vaccines that were remarkably effective, making flu vaccines and many other types of vaccines look really weak.
I think that information has been an issue with this whole pandemic, right? Because when we first got the vaccines, we felt vaccines were going to keep us from getting infected, right? And they did. And the first infections were called breakthrough infections. And then kind of the dialogue shifted, and we were told, well, vaccines are meant to prevent hospitalizations and death, and they're not going to keep you from getting
that's an important point you're making. So up until Omicron, the rate of breakthrough was less than 1%.
Right.
So we're going through Alpha and Delta and other variants in between. That fits the term breakthrough. But when they were occurring, all over the place, the breakthrough term was kind of crazy, right? I think what has happened, and you kind of alluded to this, we've had a lot of deaths since the vaccines were available. But the virus, because it's never been contained throughout the world, has continued to evolve, and it's accelerated now. And the only thing that's helping us withstand the current XBB.1.5 variant, that's the one that's now dominant in the US, is that we've had so many infections, so many vaccinations and boosters and combinations thereof, that's giving us the level of population immunity. But had we never gotten to Omicron, had the world come together and basically got the vaccinations much more widely used, adopted, not just in the US, but worldwide, we might not have had Omicron.
I think we could have killed it.
We might have gotten ahead of it. The whole idea of herd immunity, that if you get 70% of the population, the rest just basically are coasters. They don't have to get a vaccine. But unfortunately, the virus has been running ahead of us the whole time. And still today, we're way behind the virus because it's evolved to such an extent, and we may see a family beyond Omicron, Sigma or Pi, whatever Greek letter.
Yeah.
It could still happen. And we're not doing nasal vaccines, even though we have a few that are already approved in the world, particularly the one in India.
You're talking about nasal vaccines, which will be more effective at getting the infection in the first place.
Yeah, so basically, the only way the virus can get into us is through our upper airway mucosa. And so the shots don't really do much for that. They're protecting our lungs, and they have basically the neutralizing antibodies will come alive, but they're not going to block infections anymore for the current virus as it's evolved. They did before, fortunately, but they don't now. So we have very little protection. You know, yesterday there was a CDC report that with the current variant, we're getting 50% reduction of infections for a month or two.
With the bivalent vaccine.
With the bivalent vaccine, exactly.
Less with the prior iteration.
Yeah, that's right. But the point is it's short-lived, and it's not 95% anymore. So that's why we really need nasal vaccines. Because if you take a spray and it now is blocking the infection, that's what we need. Because once the infections hit, then it's the unpredictability, like long COVID, which we'll talk about, or severe COVID.
Would you have both? Would you get the nasal and the shot?
Yeah, so the ideal thing that we've seen, at least in all the experimental studies, is that the nasal would be the perfect booster once you've had the shots.
Okay.
Because you get good T-cell immunity from the shots. That basically, that's relatively variant proof.
Yeah.
But you need the nasal vaccine or oral vaccine. In China, they're using an inhaled vaccine, oral. But you need that to protect the upper airway. We have basically little protection of our upper airway, our so-called mucosal immunity.
Yeah.
And we could do this, but this country has abandoned aggressive tactics. They had Operation Warp Speed, which is what accounted for the accelerated vaccines in a large part, but we never reloaded. We've never done that again, and that was historic in terms of what it accomplished.
Eric, you've got an unusual audience here, we found out, that is made up of majority of people who've never had it. And you're telling them, even though they're all vaccinated, that you're not really protected against the primary infection, that you can get it in your nose. And what happened with Evusheld?
Yeah, Evusheld was there's about 7 million people who are immunocompromised in this country. And that means that they either have a transplant or they have cancer, particularly blood cancers or solid
steroids,
cancer, or they're taking potent immunosuppression drugs for autoimmune diseases or other reasons. 7 million at least. So the best thing we had for these folks was a monoclonal antibody combination called Evusheld. And what that did is 2 injections intramuscularly, not a deeper injection than regular shots. It provided months of protection against the virus. It's no longer effective, okay, because the virus evolved so much that basically these antibodies are working like placebo, so they've been withdrawn. We have no monoclonal antibodies effective anymore. And I did an interview with Ashish Jha this week. It was posted. Why don't we have any monoclonal antibodies? He's the czar of the COVID response at the White House. And the reason is the companies have no incentive anymore because there's no government funding to basically de-risk their efforts or to buy at scale. We have no funding for COVID anymore.
It shouldn't be that hard to make antibodies against XBB 1.5, right? We know the spike protein. We've sequenced it.
It isn't hard. The only problem is what we've seen is the antibodies only last for a couple of months until the next major virus version. So the companies don't want to make something at scale, which will take them some time and then doesn't have a long shelf life. So basically the government is not, they've de-risked the vaccines. That helped a lot. They de-risked the monoclonals from companies like Regeneron and Lilly and GSK and Vir, but they have no funds now to do the nasal vaccine, to do a universal coronavirus vaccine, to do more monoclonal antibodies. The till is empty.
It seems like there would be a big market if you made a nasal vaccine, though. Wouldn't you fund it the old traditional way of making something good and selling it?
Yeah. That's where it's headed. So what's interesting is the science work, the intellectual property of the nasal vaccines, the best ones came from the U.S. labs.
Right.
So Washington University is the one that led to the India approval, Bharat Biotech, which just published the results this week, and it's already launched in India. Now, a company, so it's Washington University, Michael Diamond and colleagues who have the patents on it, but it's basically done all the trials and all the work in India, and it's available if you go to India now.
Can you get on a pharmacychecker.com in order to have it sent?
There's another one from Mount Sinai from my friend Florian Kramer and colleagues, great nasal vaccine. It's being produced in Mexico, clinical trials and production. So since I'm in San Diego, we're thinking we'll go down to Tijuana to get that when it's available. But no, I mean, we need nasal vaccines. The point being is that the virus isn't going to go away. We're going to be looking at COVID for years to come, unfortunately, because we just didn't squash it. We didn't get ahead of it. And this is a way to get ahead of it, that and variant-proof vaccines. And the problem is we have a lot of people have willed it away. The pandemic is over. And this is the only session at the festival that's about the COVID. It's unmentionable, okay? It doesn't even exist. Well, it does exist. You all know that. And a lot of you were very careful. That's why you didn't have COVID. But the problem is, so people are tired of it, fed up, say it's gone away, and we are doing better now. This is the first winter we didn't have a massive surge in the country. So we are doing better, and that gives, the hope that we're over the worst. And it's possible that we won't get a new family beyond Omicron, but we don't know that. And the problem is, how do you get a new family? Well, somebody in southern Africa who was immunocompromised got infected. That person then had the virus evolve in them in an accelerated way, like unbelievable, 50 new mutations in the spike protein, because they had no immune system, and the virus could just run amok inside them. And then that person infected others. That's how we got, that's the leading likely story of how we got Omicron. Well, just think about right now in China.
But that can happen anywhere.
It could happen anywhere.
It can happen anywhere.
But that was at a time when there was high density of infections in southern Africa, Botswana and South Africa. Right now, we could have something like that happen in China, or it could happen here.
Yeah.
The XBB.1.5 is a U.S.-born variant.
New York City, maybe.
Well, actually, yeah, New York State, maybe possibly New York City, but it was first detected ever in the world in New York, and it led to a significant wave there. Fortunately, the rest of the country has done relatively well, unlike the Northeast that got hit hard with it.
Let's talk about testing. We still, we hate testing, right? God. Where are we going with testing? Is it going to be easier to do a home test? Are we working on something new?
This was another gaffe of this country. The rapid tests that everybody's done now, they were ready in May of 2020. They were ready in this country in May of 2020. And when did we get our hands on them, right? Like a year, half later. Unbelievable. Yeah. But basically the FDA wouldn't approve them because they thought that, and I had several discussions with FDA about this, they thought that it wasn't right that people could do home tests because it wouldn't get centrally reported and they would lose track of COVID. And that the people wouldn't know how to interpret the tests. These tests are like, all of you know. One stripe or two stripes. Duh.
Right. You're having a baby or you're not having a baby?
Or you're not having a baby. Yeah.
Right.
Help me.
We
really.
figured out things like
Unbelievable.
this. Yeah.
So this is the FDA, and this is the head of the device group is saying this to me. I'm saying, are you kidding me? But, I understood about the central reporting, and so they only approved, first batch, the companies that had obligatory central reporting. So you couldn't do the test unless it was wired so that you would, where you live would get the report. But then the tests were ridiculously expensive. Eloom and a couple of the others, nobody ever used them.
Abbott, I think, had.
Well, Binax was really one of the first tests that didn't have central reporting and was pretty accurate. Anyway, that's what should have been done. We would have had so much better suppression of COVID early on if people knew when they were gathering that people were infected. Because that's the other thing just to know. Some of you think you've never had COVID, but you probably did because it can be asymptomatic. We've done a lot of work on that. You don't know that you had it. And that's the point about gathering. People might not ever have symptoms, even days later, but they are carriers for COVID. And so the rapid testing, we should be using that a lot more. It took a long time before the government started sending out tests to people. And that's stopped now, of course.
We all laughed when the Rose Garden was all testing, and then they had that big outbreak at the Supreme
super
Court.
spreader event.
Yeah. And I was
yeah.
laughing at that until I went to my Harvard Medical School 35th reunion, and everybody had to be quadruple vaxxed, and we did a rapid test, and we had 45 people at dinner, and 23 tested positive within 3 days. I swore we were going to be on CNN, for sure,
It never got out. Maybe we should report that. I mean, to Harvard Medical School, that would attract a lot of attention.
George Daly's going to be mad at me. But so there are limits to the testing, obviously, because we all got tested and we're all, we were negative. So
yeah, no, the testing isn't perfect. It helps. It's a screen, and it helps to, but it isn't perfect. And, I think we could have better tests for sure.
Yeah.
But it is helpful.
Is that in the works? No.
No, basically, we've gone into this kind of capitulation.
Yeah.
So there's complacency, there's capitulation. We're beyond capitulation.
So when you look at the New York Times and they have that number, COVID cases in America, and they have that. What is that number based on? If most of the positives are home tests now, what is this number?
It's baseless. It has no meaning. Don't even look at that number. What you do look at is wastewater.
We got a lot of people from the New York Times at this conference there, Eric.
I know. They're great, but that reporting gives a false sense. I mean, we were having several 100,000 cases a day, and they were reporting, a tiny fraction just because they don't get centrally
But we are
reported.
getting data from testing waste?
Well, yeah, wastewater COVID is... That and hospitalizations are probably what I think are the two best ways to track what's going on in the country and in your community. Yeah. We are, fortunately, during the pandemic, wastewater really ramped up in most municipalities. It's very inexpensive and it's quite accurate. And so that is a way that we're... And what's really interesting is starting in the next few weeks in this country, they're going to take the wastewater from planes and sequence it. So... rather than looking for new variants, looking for what's going to be the next family of variants. And so that's going to become routine. There's a company that's been very successful in showing the government, and that's very low cost. But
why not airports instead of the planes?
Well, they want to basically localize where it's coming from.
I see.
Yeah, and it's simple to do. So it's interesting. I would not have thought that was going to be popular, but it looks like. At any rate, so that's the thing to check today. Unfortunately, we used to have cases as a helpful guide, but they're no longer useful.
So for these people here, they've never been infected. We're telling the pandemic's not really over, but they're sitting cheek to jowl, and they seem pretty happy about it. Are they making a mistake here? Should they be wearing masks?
Well, this is a
nice
sparsely attended group, so they're not so tight. But I was just in a room, in the last session.
I haven't seen a lot of masks this week. Last 3 days.
No, there's only about 5 or 6, 7 people here with masks. But we're in another room with Tim Miller. It was really packed, and only a few people wearing masks. So I think part of the situation is, are masks perfect? No, by no means. And you need to have a tight seal on N95 or KN95. But that problem when Omicron, why it was so incredibly transmissible, is that it basically made masks. It could override that, even properly worn. So that's why what you'd like to do is pull out all the stops. That is, we should have much better filtration of air, ventilation. Those sorts of things would help, and they should be the rule in all facilities, because we're going to have more respiratory virus pandemics. And if we don't take it seriously, this is the time to gear up. It's not that hard to get our filtration and ventilation straight, and that would be that's beyond the mask. that would really help us considerably.
I'm just trying to think, what do you recommend to people? Are you going to restaurants? Are you flying? Are you going to literary festivals?
Well,
I guess that's yes.
yeah, I mean, I kind of was in a cave for the first 2 years. I didn't go anywhere.
But not now.
But no, and now and I just try to be careful, certainly in airports and planes. In places where I don't know what's going on with the other people, I'm indoors. But obviously it's kind of silly if you're in an indoor restaurant, what are you going to do with a mask?
Yeah,
I mean,
you can't.
Yeah. But, so I don't,
Because
it's been infrequent.
you used to monitor like the cases and I would do the math. Okay, there's like the X number of people in Riverside County. That means that 1 out of 100. And if there's 200 people, I do this factorial thing. What are the odds that someone in the restaurant is going to have COVID?
Yeah,
right? But I don't have any numbers to.
Right.
To
Everybody
do this.
thinks that if you're indoor, you're all protected. Well, Lindsay Marr, who's a great scientist from Virginia Tech on this whole transmission and air quality story, we had a great podcast together. But I told her during that, our son went on a date with a woman, and they sat outside, both of them very conscious about. And he got COVID from her. She at the time had no symptoms. And that's the whole point, is you can get COVID outdoors as long as you're talking to somebody and it's an adequate length of time. So just being outdoors is not the answer.
Maybe your son was closer to her than he told you.
That's good. That's good. That's good. I like that. At any rate, yeah. So, could be.
You don't tell Dad everything.
Right. Any rate, so, yeah, there you have it. Anyway, these are things we can do, but, what's disappointing is, so the CDC, I love it, last week they put out action plan for the immunocompromised. And what do they have to offer for the action plan for the immunocompromised? Nothing. Nothing. I mean, they should have just told the truth, saying, we're sorry, we have no monoclonal antibodies, we have nothing special to offer you, besides saying, get your bivalent vaccine and wear a mask. And it's sad because 7 million people, that's a lot of people who are vulnerable. Yeah. And they are right now, along with people of advanced age, the most vulnerable people.
Now, let's say one of these people is unlucky enough to test positive a couple days from now.
Yeah.
All right. You want to talk about Paxlovid for a
little
bit?
So if I would take Paxlovid. There are some features about it that aren't great. I mean, it can make your taste go way off. It can also cause a lot of GI disturbances. But if you can take it for 5 days, it appears to reduce the chance of long COVID, which is, to me, the most dreaded thing.
Even if you get a rebound, does it still?
Yeah, the rebound has been exaggerated. We did the first systematic study where every person did testing for 21 days, and we had controls.
Yeah.
Turns out people who don't have Paxlovid have rebound too, okay?
You mean they turn negative and then turn positive?
Yeah,
again?
they turn positive. They get symptoms, after they feel better. And so it's about 10% is the rate of rebound. And, everybody thought, well, because Biden got it and Fauci got it and all these people had a rebound, that everyone gets rebound. I even thought it was much more common until we did a careful study of hundreds of people. So rebound is not the reason and to not take it, and the drug interactions have been grossly over.
What was the percentage in non-Paxlovid treated people?
Well, it was like 14 versus 4, so it was 10% excess.
Difference.
Yeah. And that's whether you
in vaccinated individuals.
Yeah, in vaccinated
because
people.
I thought the data for Paxlovid in vaccinated individuals was not so impressive with hard endpoints.
Actually, it is. So some of the early studies suggested maybe it doesn't work as well in vaccinated, but as we got a lot more effectiveness studies, it actually has replicated the 90% suppression of hospitalizations or deaths.
Okay.
Of course, they're lower, but so is the proportionate reduction the same. So the reason to take Paxlovid would be, first, you inactivate the virus. And if you can inactivate the virus early, that's going to be your best shot at not getting long COVID that we know of. The best way to prevent long COVID is never to get COVID. But second best, if you get it,
So Paxlovid knocks out the replication, doesn't necessarily kill the virus, knocks out replication, and your body has time to try to...
Yeah, it can't replicate. You basically clear the virus earlier. And a lot of people that have long COVID, which we haven't discussed yet, one of the issues we know, in some of them at least, that they have reservoirs of the virus. They have remnants of the virus, whether it's in their intestine or other parts of the body. And that's why the Paxlovid story in many people have even helped them. Many case studies where they took Paxlovid and their symptoms of long COVID got much better.
So if you took Paxlovid, if you got it, you take Paxlovid, and then you were in that unlucky 10%, would you take Paxlovid again?
Yeah, I mean, if your symptoms are significant, you could take another 5-day course.
Because it's not really recommended, except Fauci did it.
Well, no, I mean, I know many people who've done it. Fauci got quite sick in the rebound. If you get sick, take it, because it will alleviate your symptoms pretty quickly. It's pretty impressive that within several hours, you're going to feel a lot better. It works. But the problem you're bringing up is, how long will it work? We've already seen... it works on the main protease called MPRO, which is responsible for replication of the virus. And we've already seen mutations in that protein that have occurred in people who've taken Paxlovid. And the question is, months from now, will we start to see Paxlovid resistance? Hopefully not. But if we do, we have no backup pill for Paxlovid. And so that's a liability. I hope we don't go there, but we know it's a potential.
You just published a big paper in Nature about long COVID. Really, it's so comprehensive. And anybody who's interested in long COVID, encourage you to go and check that out.
It's actually amazing. This paper has had more downloads, altmetric, than any paper I've been involved in years.
Tell us about the authors, because I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, so the Nature journal that commissioned me, asked me if I would do this. I said, well, I haven't had long COVID. I have colleagues and many people I know with long COVID. I don't want to do it unless I can get a co-author, at least one or more, who know this condition. Because a lot of people don't really understand how severe this can be.
So this is very big at the literary festival, writing from your lived experience. It's
a
common theme here.
Yeah. So one of my colleagues, Julia Moore-Vogel at Scripps Research, and then I recruited 2 other long COVID people who I knew were really superb researchers, patients with long COVID. Hannah Davis and Lisa McCorkle. So the 4 of us worked on it together. And because the 3 co-authors each have been suffering from long COVID early on in the pandemic, there are certain parts, we had to go through multiple revisions, peer review, editor review. I mean, it was endless. This went on for over a year, back and forth. But there were times when each of them couldn't work on it because they were knocked out from long COVID. The point is, all 3 of these women in their 30s to 40s, mostly young, less than age 40, they all were athletes. They all were incredibly functional women who became incapacitated, who couldn't walk a block or 2 without being breathless, who would have basically profound fatigue and all sorts of other symptoms, whether it's migraine or chest pain or joint pains or all the whole postural tachycardia syndrome. Yeah. So they know this condition. And when I did the NPR recent interview about it, and they said, well, is it right to have authors who have the condition? I said, are you kidding? I said, it's not right to not have authors. Because not having had it, I could basically do the check and balance about, they review the literature, we all did it together, and this will be the legacy of the pandemic. Not only the millions of lives that we've lost and the millions of people who were so desperately ill, but those who still haven't had light yet from having had the infection. And oftentimes in these people, typically in their 30s and 40s, never hospitalized, mild to moderate COVID, they got better and then weeks later it hit them, and they've never been right since. Now, some people do recover, but all too often they suffer. And we have no treatment, we have no diagnostic tests for them, and we have doctors who see these people and they tell them there's nothing wrong with them. They're depressed. It's in their head. I mean, sick stuff, you know. It's really galling.
One thing I learned from your column I'd never realized is the data about the 1918.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is something else that the known unknowns, right? So in 1918, there was the influenza pandemic. And during that time, you know, millions died, but wasn't known at the time that getting that influenza strain, that 15 years later and beyond, it was a major risk factor for developing Parkinson's disease. Wow. But it took 15 to 20 years later to make the connection. Wow. And then just all these people were coming in with Parkinson's and they had a common thread. And, you know, right now we've learned that multiple sclerosis is tied to the Epstein-Barr virus, right? So we're learning about that. We don't even know, you know, long COVID affects virtually every organ system. You know, the risk for stroke and heart attack and heart arrhythmias and reproductive system and, you know, the whole, you name it. But what if there's things that it can do we're not aware of? The brain fog is a prominent symptom. But the concern is, will there be accelerated neurodegenerative diseases, as was seen with the influenza of 1918? We just don't know.
And maybe it sheds some light into why we have neurodegenerative diseases in the first place, right?
Right.
I remember reading some article years ago that there was a San Francisco 49ers team where 3 members eventually developed ALS. And I said, well, that seems like a really strange, such a rare illness for a small group of people to have. And maybe there was some infectious thing back then. So maybe a lot of these things that we just don't, that we see and we just say, oh, you know, really bad luck, could have been a sequelae of infection. So we're going to learn more.
Yeah, we have to have a lot of humility and not think that we know. We know lots of mechanisms why people could get long COVID, but we don't know about the sequela enough, and we sure haven't come up with a definitive validated treatment yet, which is unsettling. The United States government has put in $1 billion to the NIH for the so-called RECOVER program, which gives some optimism, but we have no RECOVER path yet. And we need to get on this full court press because a lot of people really are hurting.
Early on, it seemed like every time I picked up and was trying to make sense of data and the trends, it was always like, this is what's going on in Israel, and this is what's going on in South Africa, and this is the data from Great Britain. And you didn't really see our data industry here. I know you're so big on data. Was that the big disappointment, or was there, why was it that the U.S. didn't have more data?
Well, not only did it not have the data, but our public health agencies made light of the data from other countries. Like, if it wasn't U.S. data, you can't believe it. So the best example of that was the boosters. So you may remember, summer of 2021, August, President Biden came out and said, every adult's going to get a booster shot. If you're 6 months out, everybody's going to. And then he came out like every other day, several days more, to change the message. Well, maybe only this age, and maybe, you know, everything was complete chaos.
Yeah.
Well, meanwhile, the data were absolutely clear from Israel that we were going to need boosters because of the waning of the immunity and reliance on these neutralizing antibodies. And we didn't ever, in this country, make boosters a definitive recommendation till November 29th for all people, all adults. Yeah. And so during those months, people they were waiting for the word from this country, even though the data from Israel and then the UK was unequivocal. So these are, you know, kind of many botches that our public health agencies have made. Another one that you will remember is when the CDC said, you get COVID, 5 days, and then you're good to go. Don't worry after that. Well, that's the way to spread COVID, okay? There's never been any data to say that after 5 days you're good to go. That's why you need to do testing. It averages at least 7 to 8 days. So how could a CDC tell people that that's okay?
Should should we be using home testing as an indicator of being infectious?
Yeah, the rapid test 2 days in a row that's negative, that's about as good as you're going to get.
So you get COVID, you're diagnosed, wait 5 days, test 2 days in a row. If it's negative, then you're okay to go out. Otherwise, continue quarantining until you get 2 days in a row of negative tests.
Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't
Yeah.
even probably start till day 6 or 7. But if you get
Yeah.
2 days negative, then you can assure you're not just yourself, but people you're going to be gathering with that you're not going to be
So we use that as a
infectious.
surrogate, and we have good reason to do that.
Yes, I mean that's all we have right now.
Yeah, because we know if you're testing positive, you're probably. But do we really know that if you're testing negative, the second day that you are not?
I mean, nothing's 100%, but it's
Good.
pretty darn close.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And so there is a sense that as COVID has come along, has evolved, that it's become more infectious and less deadly. I think that's kind of our perception in the community. Would you say that's true?
Okay. Well, Omicron was the one that gave us that impression. So I want to just go back.
Yeah.
Before Omicron, there was Delta.
Right.
And Delta was worse, more virulent, more pathogenic than its predecessor. Yeah. So that idea that the virus just keeps going and burns itself out is completely flawed. Now with Omicron, what we saw was first Southern Africa reported data that maybe the people aren't as sick. Well, that was compensated for the fact that 10 times as many people were getting infected. And so the small reduction of the virulence or how sick they were getting was overwhelmed by the number of people that were getting sick with COVID. So it was immaterial, basically. What's happened, the current variant, which, this New York State-born variant.
XBB 1.5. We're getting worse with the names.
Yeah, terrible. Yeah. Why WHO doesn't give this a name that people can come up with is dreadful. But at any rate, this variant is a double whammy because it's a fusion of 2 prior variants with 2 mutations on top of it that makes it more transmissible or contagious. And that's, to your point, why have we handled that relatively well?
Yeah.
And it's because we've had so many infections and boosters and vaccines and combos. And that's it's not the virus, it's that we have built up this immunity wall. Now, is it a great wall? No. And especially in people 65 and older. If you're 65 and older.
That's pretty much our entire community, by the way.
Except you. You and Susan. No, I think the issue here is what we have is, I mean, this is dreadful. In all the countries, our peer countries, like the UK and Western Europe and South Korea, Japan, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia. If you're over 65, the chance of you having had a booster recently is at least 80 to 90%. Protect the elderly. Protect the seniors. In this country, what's the percent of people that had a booster within the last 6 months?
30%?
Well, it's gotten up to 39%. But it's horrible. It's less than half of peer countries because people have just...
Fatigue.
Yeah,
They're just tired of,
what happened here, again, I hate to keep faulting the CDC, but they really deserve some of this. They put it out for everyone age 5 and older to get the bivalent booster. Why not concentrate on the high-risk people, which is what they did, of course. One thing that's exemplary in this country that we can be proud of is that 95% of seniors got 2 shots. That's great. Why we should have that still for the bivalent booster, and we don't.
Or is it taking away from the elder? Is that your point? That when they
when they put it out diffusely, everyone should get a bivalent booster.
It weakens the message.
Yeah, I think so. And I discussed this with them, and
But if you're 20, you should probably still get the booster, wouldn't you? If you had never had it.
The benefit there is much less. I mean, you're looking at maybe a tiny protection of long COVID and hospitalization. It's very tiny.
You've got grandchildren. Is there an age under which you would not give them a shot?
No, they've all had shots. But the question is, what about age 5? We have an 8-year-old grandson. Are we going to push for him to get a bivalent? No. I mean, it's just, he's had 3 shots, and he's had Omicron. I mean, I think what are we going to get out of exposing another shot? So
If he was 3 years old, would you have him get a shot?
I think the data supports children of all ages, it's 6 months and up, should get vaccinated. But the question is, how many shots? Just 2?
Yeah.
They had a shot. They had Omicron or some COVID in the last year. Probably even just 1 shot's enough. But
So the additional benefit of boosters is to prevent serious infection or to prevent the primary to be getting infected.
Yeah, so I kind of think that the data is unequivocal for age 50 and older, and even you could back it down to 40. And this is actually a really fun...
To reduce both outcomes.
To reduce all bad outcomes.
Yeah.
This is a fundamental point. What you have is, people like Paul Offit, and he's got a little kind of cadre of friends that say only the oldest people should get boosters. And, I had a long discussion with him very recently. He's only had 3 shots, and he's over 65. The point being is that if you look at all the data, there's proof points that anyone over 18 will benefit from a bivalent booster. But if you fractionate the data, so-called subgroup analysis, which isn't pre-specified, so you say, I'm going to only look at the people 55 and older, or I want to look at the 35. Yeah. You get all kinds of kooky results. So we only have the data, U.S. data, and as you mentioned earlier, we've got data from other countries. Other countries have not made the boosters available across all ages. Most countries, it's age 50 or 60 as a cutoff.
So sorry, ran over a few seconds there, but if you have questions, and I'm sure you do, why don't you come up afterwards, because we need to keep the mood for the rest of the crowd. Okay? But thank you so much for coming, everybody.